وصلى الله على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. Greetings of peace. Welcome everybody to Path and Present Podcast. This is your host Baraka Blue, and we have a wonderful podcast this week. I want to start off with just a few updates or announcements. The first one is that I'll be in the UAE at the end of March and early April. April 2nd, I'll be at NYU Abu Dhabi for a series of programs. And in fact, the program that I'll be doing fits very well with the theme of this week's podcast, because the event is called Spirituality in Storytelling, Sufi Poetry, and the Islamic Oral Tradition. So as you'll see, this podcast is very much about storytelling. So that's where I'll be early April, and then second half of April I'll be in the States. I'll be doing a series of programs with Wasat in Seattle, but we'll announce that a bit later. But the other thing that I really wanted to announce is that April is Poetry Month, and in addition to being Poetry Month, which is a great time to celebrate poetry, it is also the month right before Ramadan. Ramadan starts May 5th, I believe, the beginning of May this year. And the third thing that April is it's the 1 year anniversary of the Rumi Center online courses that we've been doing. So we've been doing a course every quarter for a year now, and that's great news, and we want to celebrate. And in celebration of those three things, we're going to be offering another Opening the Eye of the Heart course for April, and I believe it'll begin April 7th. You can find information for this at rumicenterworkshops.com, but I really want to encourage everybody because it's going to be a great time. We're going to celebrate poetry for Poetry Month. We're going to celebrate the fact that this course has been going now, and hundreds of people have gone through the course. And we're going to celebrate the fact that this is a profound tool for preparing our hearts and our presence for Ramadan. So we welcome everybody. If you haven't taken the course yet, you're most welcome. We really explore writing as a spiritual practice. We read different mystical poets from all across the world, and we talk about some of the tools and tricks of the trade, so to speak, the craft of poetry. But it's really for everybody. It's not just for poets or writers. It's for everybody who would like some more stillness, some presence, some introspection, as well as just to be in a cohort of really amazing, loving, supportive, creative people on the spiritual path. So if you're interested, again, that's rumicenterworkshops.com, and these tend to fill up pretty quick. So if you're interested in that, please do check it out. Yes. So as for this podcast, the guest is Cyrus Zargar, and Cyrus is a professor at Central Florida. He is the El Ghazali Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Central Florida. And he wrote a great book, one of my favorite books of 2018. It's called The Polished Mirror, Storytelling and the Pursuit of Virtue in Islamic Philosophy and Sufism. And I love it because he speaks about imagination. He speaks about the power of story, which, all art forms are forms of storytelling, and just the importance of storytelling for the human soul, particularly as it was seen by the great philosophers and the great mystics of Islam in forming the soul and actually drawing the soul into the divine presence. So I really loved it. It's a great topic, and we had a great conversation. So check out the book and definitely check out the conversation. Lastly, what I wanted to say is, please, first of all, thank you for listening and supporting the podcast. It's been great. It's been growing a lot. And this year we made a commitment to try to be more consistent. We've been averaging one a month, but we're trying to double that this year. So, and your support makes that possible. So please continue to share it with anybody who you think might like it. Word of mouth is the best. And then if you have an iPhone or Apple products, definitely subscribe on iTunes, because that will allow it to come into your phone to be downloaded every time that we release it. And then please, if you haven't yet, rate, like, and comment on the iTunes, because that helps it move up the charts and helps more people see it. And then lastly, if you have the means, please do support us on Patreon. And Patreon is a way that people can support content creators. Patreon.com/pathandpresent is our Patreon page for this podcast. And as much as this is a labor of love, there are a number of costs that go into this, including the editing, website stuff, not to mention the technology needed to make this happen, microphones, computers, etc. So please do support if you can, and that just helps us put more time and energy into it as well. And one of the things that we're going to be doing this year, that we're going to be trying out, is we're recording videos of some of these podcasts, including this one. And so some of you can see me if you're watching this as opposed to just listening. And we're releasing those exclusively for the Patreon supporters. So everyone who supports on Patreon can see this and can see these conversations. And, anyone who supports with $1, $5, or anything like that gets access to that. So please check that out and support if you can, because you make this possible. All right, y'all. The Polished Mirror: Storytelling and the Pursuit of Virtue in Islamic Philosophy and Sufism is a book that is my favorite book of 2018. And I was trying to think of why. And it's related to a question that I was wondering for you, which is essentially the kind of why this book. And as I was thinking of why this book is important for me, it kind of relates to the fact that all art forms are, in their essence, storytelling, right? They're a mode of storytelling. And a good story, and you have a line in here that maybe you could even expand on, about, I think it was in the chapter on Ibn Sina, if I'm not mistaken, this idea that a profound story, especially like an allegory, a story that has deep meanings that can be drawn from it and that has symbolic value, it's at once engaging the kind of peak of your intellect or your rational faculty, because you're engaging in truth. You're kind of discovering truth, but it's also engaging the peak of your imaginative faculty, right? Because it's doing it through story, through narrative, through symbol, through, projecting this, this world in your inner eye. Like we have a movie theater inside of ourselves. Right. When we read a story, we hear a story, we see all the characters, and we actually inside of us make the whole, the set, the whole narrative. And that's why when you read a book that's really profound and then you watch the movie, even if it's a good movie, it's never as good as the book. Right. Yeah. Because you're like, that's not how the character looked. That's not how his home looked, because you have it in your mind's eye. Yeah. So, I'm just curious in what made you want to engage this topic, and particularly the relationship between storytelling and the pursuit of virtue, and what makes storytelling a profound tool for virtue and for self-transformation.
Those are great questions. Yeah, I think that you and I share this interest in art and storytelling. And so for me, I think the key was the poetry of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. And, even before I started the book, there's a, from whether from graduate school or from after that, when it was, just reading articles or books about Rumi. I mean, there's so many different ways to approach him, but what you see less of, or even almost nothing of in academic literature is, how do you read Rumi's poetry, especially his narrative poetry, to become a complete human being? Mm. Right? And because that seems like that's the purpose for his intended audience. I mean, it's even sometimes it's the stated purpose, right, for his intended audience. So that was what was really interesting for me. So even before I got into the book, for me, it was, I was thinking about Rumi's narrative poetry, his storytelling, and how he sort of communicates this, the completion of human potential. And what I realized is that in order to get to the bottom of it, I need to understand all these other strains of thought that are informing his writing, and that includes Islamic philosophy, even though he's not keen on the philosophers, and so in a way, that was what at the very, very, very beginnings informed the book. I wanted to write a book about virtue ethics, but I really wanted to get to that Rumi. That's why I put his chapter last. That's why I kind of felt like the whole thing was building to that. And there's a magic to the way, to answer the second part of your question. If you read Rumi, or if you read the poet Sadi, or if you read Attar, and I'm naming the Persian examples, but on the other hand, if you read Khalil wa Dimna, or if you read the allegories that you mentioned in Arabic, there's something different between between telling someone that something is virtuous and describing it, and illustrating it for them in an example, so they can have something to imitate, so they understand it in context. And I think the key word is context, because that's how human beings do moral reasoning. They think about their context, and they think about, very often, what would a virtuous person do in this context? They have this imagined ideal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you raise a couple things which I'm really interested in. The first one is in Rumi. Obviously, we share that deep inspiration, Maulana Rumi, and I was thinking about this recently because it was Christmas, and most of my family's Christian. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking of most, I think, educated Christian people in the West know that Jesus and Mary are mentioned in the Quran, but what a lot of people don't know is the kind of centrality of Jesus in Sufism, in Islamic spirituality, especially the kind of as this symbol of the ruh, the higher self. And because of, in the Quran, him being called Ruh Allah, the Spirit of God. And I was kind of reflecting on this very simple, I guess you could call it an allegory, even though it's only a few lines, this idea of Jesus riding on his donkey through the marketplace that Rumi talks about. Yeah. And that Jesus being drunk on God and the donkey being drunk on barley. And that, it's kind of comical, but it's also, in a few lines, a very profound teaching, because Jesus is the ruh, the spirit. Right. So he symbolizes the spiritual potential of actualization, of realization, of awakening within each of us. But yet the donkey, that dumb ass, is also something inside of each one of us. Right. And that's the nafs al-amara bisu, that lower self, which is commanding us to egotism, to selfishness. And what's profound is that they're both drunk. Yeah. But they're just drunk on their own level. And really what's beautiful about that is the legal theorists may say, don't get drunk. Right. But what Rumi's saying is quite the opposite. He's saying, I'm not going to say don't get drunk, but I'm just going to say upgrade your intoxicants. There's something better that you can be drunk upon. And all the things of this world, not only the kind of physical pleasures of food and copulation, but even the kind of things that the ego desires, such as wealth and fame and notoriety and kind of esteem in the eyes of men and power and all these things. Those are all barley, the cheapest grains. It's like the slop that you toss to the pigs, compared to those who have awakened to the wine of spiritual realization, of ma'rifah, and awakened this higher faculty of perception and are experiencing the divine effulgence and unfolding in their very being. Yeah. For them, they're experiencing a type of drunkenness which is so far beyond any type of joy or pleasure or drunkenness in this world, that if you knew, like as the Sufis say, if the kings and rulers knew of the experiences we have, they would send their armies to fight us for it. Right? There's a higher potential of experience. So just in that simple kind of comical allegory of just Jesus on a donkey in the marketplace, he's telling this profound teaching. And that he also mentions that most people, or a lot of people, right, they're for the saints, the Jesus is really like guiding and disciplining the donkey. It's in control. But for a lot of people, the roles are reversed, and the donkey has mounted their Jesus and is shackled their spiritual nature and telling it where to go.
Right.
And so I think about that because, in the Mesnavi, Rumi's masterpiece, it's, thousands and thousands of lines of couplets and telling all these different stories, from the reed flute to the donkey and Jesus, to the lion in the mirror, from mythical creatures to prophetic prophets from history. But in a sense, you could say, I'm curious if you would agree with this, but what I was reflecting on is, in a sense, you could say it's all telling one narrative in a thousand different ways, which is that this narrative of the human potential and human awakening. And there are the prophets and the saints and sages, and we have this ability to be the reed flute that is empty for the divine breath to blow through, or the mirror that is polished, as you call your book, for the divine names and qualities and attributes to fully reflect. And all the stories are illustrating this, and that's the purpose of existence. And so, but on the what's amazing, and I'd like to hear, what you have to say about this as well, is that Rumi decides on some level that he's not going to write a philosophical treatise. He's not going to write a step-by-step manual of the path, but that the best way to guide the disciples is through art. That he's going to write a poem, and that's how he's going to take you to this realization.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. And if you actually, I very much agree with with the way you're seeing, Rumi's storytelling and his writing. I mean, and if you think about that example of the donkey, I mean, it also changes from here on out. If you lived in that world where it would be common for people to ride, beasts of burden, you're going to look at things differently.
Yes.
It changes the way you see the world. The other point, just kind of following up on what you're saying. This is from Ibn al-Arabi, because I'm working on this article about Jesus and speech in Ibn al-Arabi, the concepts of speech and speech of the soul. Yeah, relative to us, Jesus is ruh. Relative to God, to Allah, he's nafs. And so there's this beautiful thing where he has this ability to communicate. He's a kind of like a go-between, an intermediary. He's intermediary between the two. So. It's a very profound way of seeing the world, and that's why I think sometimes it lends itself to repetition, right? Because it's it's not the kind of thing that you just learn and move on. It's the kind of thing that you hear more often, and it sets in.
Yes.
It's worth it to hear it a number of different ways until you actually really get it.
Yeah. And I mean, even in our modern world where, the profound medium of storytelling now is movies, which are like storytelling with light, interestingly enough. Right.
Yeah.
And, the kind of movies that become like, not only box office hits, but kind of like touchstones for our society that we can all reference, are often these allegorical stories.
That's true.
Like The Matrix, like Lord of the Rings. Obviously, Star Wars is maybe even the best example.
That's true.
And these are, right, people will reference them in daily speech, right? Red pill or blue pill. You know what I mean? Like,
dark side. Yeah.
Where you're going to the dark side, right? Yeah. People will reference like, Yoda and kind of in essence of, and then Lord of the Rings, of course. So, and these are profound teachings. And actually, like you say, I think they strike us because even if we don't realize it, in a way that we could articulate intuitively, we realize that there's some relation to us and to our world, right?
Yeah.
The Matrix isn't just a good story, but there's something that it's getting at that is happening here and now.
Yeah, it's a shared event that helps all of us make sense of our world.
Mhm.
You know, it's like we have some perceived problem, threat, fear, lack, and what the filmmaker, the writer, I mean, what makes film so special, I think, is all the different kinds of artistry that go on in it. You've got music, you've got the visual arts, you've got the cinematography, you've got the screenwriting. It's a really beautiful medium in that way. I mean, it involves everything. But as you pointed out earlier on, you know, when we were talking, the flip side is that it leaves out, it gives you so much that the role of the imagination, right, is lessened. But what the filmmaker does is take all of that and as you say, give it a kind of narrative sense. And then we know that we share that experience, you know. And that's why for a lot of people, you know, if they don't understand the context, they don't like to watch older movies, you know. It just doesn't connect with them as well because they have no idea what was going on back then. Or if they see it, they'll interpret it in a way that's just incorrect. That's not what it meant at that time. So that's a very good point.
So I think you talk about it in your paper, but why do you think that Rumi and others within the Sufi tradition more generally, or the philosophical tradition, why do they talk about this? Do they talk about what we're saying, essentially, that the kind of effectiveness of stories to affect the human soul, to transform a person?
They do. Well, one thing that comes to mind immediately is but I can think of a few examples. But the one thing that immediately comes to mind are, as you said, the opening verses of the Masnavi, you know, the Beshno Asne, listen to the read. And then there's different versions, but some say, you know, as it tells the story, as it's narrating. And then what's it narrating? It's narrating its complaint. It's telling you the story of separations, right? As Judaiha, it's complaining and telling you this story that has to do with that it once belonged to this place, and then it was separated from that place. You know how it begins, right? And all longing, all human pain is really that pain for the origin, for the place of origin, which is God. But it's also a commentary on story, because if all longing and all pain is that, then in a sense what Rumi's saying is all narrative is that. And that's why I really agreed with the way you were reading the Masnavi, right? All narrative is this story of being separated from the origin and going back to it. Now he doesn't say that, but I mean it's implied. It's like, you know, this is what makes storytelling valuable. There are comments on that. Was always something that interested me, was art and beauty in Sufism. Yeah. I think my first book, Sufi Aesthetics, that was the focus. And the one thing that I find interesting is that you know, in Rumi's time, there was a kind of agreement that art that involved language was the highest expression of art and the highest expression of beauty. And there's this common kind of disparaging of the visual arts. Ghazali does it. You know, in a way, Rumi does it with the story which he borrows from Ghazali, but that, you know, that appears in the book, the story
Chinese and the Byzantines, right? The painting.
Yeah, because I mean, it's nothing or polishing is better than these, you know, little drawings. There's kind of almost this dismissal of visual art. Right. But there's this.
For those that don't know that story, would you just like really quick just
share that? And I might get it mixed up because Ghazali and Rumi, they flip them. They tell them the role of the Byzantines and the Chinese are flipped. So in the two versions, but so the story goes that there's a king, and the king wants to decide who are the better artisans and the better craftsmen, the Byzantines or the Greeks, and on the one hand, and the Chinese on the other. And he gives them sort of two walls in between which there's a barrier, so they can't see each other's work, and they're supposed to, you know, do what they will with the walls and show their prowess as artists. So I think in Rumi's story, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Chinese, right, who start to do the drawings. They make this beautiful elaborate thing.
I remembered it the other way around. That
Okay, so you might be right.
But,
yeah,
but
okay.
I can't remember either.
I'll do it the other way around, because as I said, in it's interesting that Rumi flips whatever it was.
That is, I didn't notice that.
Yeah. So okay, so the let's say the Greeks began to decorate lavishly this with all this fine artwork one side of the wall, whereas the Chinese, right, the other side, they just start to clean it and polish it and take everything down and scrub it. And when the king comes to make his decision and lifts the barrier between them, he looks at one side, and the ornate decorations are beautiful, but then when he looks at the other side, what they've created is this mirror. And when the artistry of the other side is reflected in the mirror, it actually becomes more beautiful. It gains a kind of luminosity in its reflection that it didn't have on that side, right? And so it is very interesting. Kind of. I always think of HD television when I hear that, because sometimes things look better on HD TV than they do in reality. But anyways, so so of course Ghazali uses this as a means to discuss knowledge and the acquisition. The concept that we think a lot about knowledge as acquisition, but real true knowledge is not a matter of acquiring things, acquiring facts and acquiring forms in the soul, but rather what really is about stripping down, and so that you're reflecting knowledge. You become this kind of passive receptacle for knowledge. And Rumi uses it for a similar thing. But I'm saying that sort of there's also a subtle dismissal of the visual arts, and sometimes it's not so subtle. Ibn al-Arabi says it pretty explicitly that it's he calls them drawings in the hammams.
So is it because of this fact that the visual arts engage your imagination, in the sense that you, in your mind's eye, you get to see the visuals, whereas it's for actual visual things, it kind of, they do the imagination's work for you. Yeah. When you hear someone tell a story, again, the projector displays it in your mind's eye. You see the movie inside of yourselves, whereas when you watch a movie or a painting, it kind of does that work for you. Is that one of the reasons, or is there something else?
There might be an element of that, but usually what it is that it's these figures in this time period really saw language as a means to the truth. Right. They saw language as they had what you'd call a logocentric worldview, where the word has been revealed by God. So Allah, when Allah gave human beings the greatest manifestation of Himself, it was in words. And I think that's why poetry was so important to them as well, because poetry captures meaning in a way that the other arts don't. It's also, I think, a cultural thing. Right. I mean, there certainly was art. There was, quite a lot of it. But I just think for them, these were scholars who had been trained really to think about words.
Right. And I think that ties in really beautifully with the fact that everywhere that Islam spreads, that poetry becomes, it unleashes a kind of flood of poetry in every single language of the Muslims. That's true. I think that has to do with the Quran itself and the centrality of the Quran, that this is kind of a poetic or super poetic speech, but it's at the center of a civilization. So everything is kind of a commentary on it. So it kind of creates this symbolic universe. And I was thinking about that when we talk about story, because we're all kind of living in a story, in the sense that, and someone living right next door, especially in the modern world, they may be living in a totally different story. In the sense that, like, and that's what's beautiful about friendship and companionship and people on the path, especially because you have the shared narrative. So just like an inside joke, you can you don't have to say much. You could say one word and we know what we're talking about. Right. And same with Rumi and all these things. It's just like, we can just reference Jesus. We can reference Fir'aun. We can reference the wine. We can reference the reed flute, and everyone knows what's going on. Right. You know what I mean? Whereas other people outside of that story people that come to Rumi now 800 years later from a Western modern, they need a lot of that stuff to be explained. They can appreciate the beauty, and some of it is very clear, but also there's a level of deep symbolism which is going to be lost if you're not inside that story.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And we have our own symbols that we've developed, our own cultural symbols. And that's what makes translation so difficult.
Yes.
I mean, when you look at the work of Coleman Barks, on the one hand, it's some scholars of Rumi are sort of hesitant to embrace it, but on the other hand, there's a kind of brilliance to it.
Yes.
I mean, I can't deny myself way back, in my youth, opening up a book. I didn't know, Persian. I can't deny opening up a book, the beauty in opening up Coleman Barks' translations and just being sucked into it. Because what he was able to do is take some concepts from Rumi and then take the symbolic language that we all live in, and put this in that or draw it into it. And in a way, that's a really beautiful act of translation. Of course, yes, if you want to study Rumi, you have to study Rumi. It's not the kind of translation that'll do it for you.
Sure.
It's a much harder thing to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that. I really feel the same way. And people, especially, I get why Muslims often are like, oh, they complain about the popular versions of Rumi, but it's like, how about also looking at the fact that like people love Rumi, people love in our culture, love it. It's been made beautiful to them.
Yeah.
And like, let's celebrate that. And then let's be a bridge to some of the deeper meanings if that's the case.
Right. And they complained, right. It's a justified objection that the Rumi of these translations is often this, Protestant friendly, kind of hippie.
He's a beat poet.
Yeah. And that's all. I get that. Right. That's okay. But who owns Rumi? So that's Coleman Barks speaking to some audience that he wants. That's fine. I agree. We should historicize things, and we should know it. That's the work that I do.
Yeah.
But I also have to acknowledge that it's not going to have that kind of appeal because, as you said, you have to learn that language.
Sure.
It's a lot. There's a lot of work to put into it. To learn about the context, to see, and then sometimes to be disappointed because you'll admit, I think, that when you read Rumi and he talks about, a person beating a child, or sometimes the way he depicts women, or you'd be like, whoa, Rumi, what happened? Well, what happened is he's a man of the 13th century, and that's going to show up, and that's not the kind of poetry that Barnes and Noble is going to be able to sell to a mass audience. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, mashallah. And it's interesting, how cultural things change, right? It was Nicholson who he was embarrassed by some of the kind of more like sultry body kind of aspects of Rumi. So he translated those parts into Latin because he was embarrassed to translate them to English.
Yeah.
It was just ajib.
That's interesting. Yeah, I remember. I remember seeing those, and for the first time, being like, "What is he doing?"
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think, and for me, I reflected on this a lot because, the two things that I really remember from middle school, like that happened inside the classroom.
Yeah.
Right. I remember like girls and basketball games and stuff like that. But actually, like things that I remember from inside the classroom are very few. But the two that stand out, the number one is the day that our teacher taught us Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And I was in 7th grade.
Okay.
And I'll never forget it. I knew it hit me, it pierced me in my heart. Like, this is real, and this is true, and this is happening. We're in the cave. Yeah. And then the second one was we were studying Shakespeare, and we acted out Romeo and Juliet. And our teacher was same teacher, very good teacher. And she had us act it out, but instead of Capulets and Montagues, it was Bloods and Crips. So she made it like real for art. Like this is they were rival gangs. So this is, and, again, one of them, Plato, in a sense that Allegory of the Cave can be said to be almost like a foundational allegory of Western civilization.
Yeah.
Plato, everyone's commenting on Plato. And then Shakespeare, often seen as kind of the pinnacle of the English language, and the profundity of him is his development of character and the nuanced explorations of human choice and subjectivity vis-a-vis all these characters.
Right.
So this really speaks to me that there's something about narrative, there's something about allegory, which can somehow awaken in us a deeper understanding. Even in my kind of jumbled, 13, 14-year-old brain, there was something that pierced through everything, and that altered me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. The interesting part is this debate as to like where someone like Avicenna, stood on allegory.
Yeah.
Because it seems, at least, Gutash, others have argued that, for him, it's just a means to an end, and it's a lower form of, kind of bringing someone to these realizations. Right. That if someone can grasp them without the allegory, then that means a sort of more, sort of a better ability to do the art of intellection and to get.
Yes.
But when you look at what he's doing with the stories and with the allegories and the subtleties that are in them, right, and the hints, and then you look at those who interpreted his allegories, and you look at what Sohrawardi does, right, the philosopher. It's hard not to agree with you, just what you said, that there's something profound that comes out of learning something through an allegory that you don't get by just learning, by just doing the reasoning process straightforward without any story. Yeah,
I remember that. Yeah, and Avicenna, and even Ghazali kind of takes that from Ibn Sina, this idea that, like, because Ghazali and Ibn Sina, they'll both kind of like say a theoretic abstract thing, and then they'll be like, and for the more dense of mind, for the more like stupid people, here's an allegory.
I can see why, and Ghazali, he uses more allegories in his Persian writing than he does in the Arabic one, in the Kimia Sa'adat than he does in the Ihya Ulumuddin.
Yeah.
And that would seem to suggest that because his Persian audience is the people who could read Arabic wouldn't need to read the Persian, right? So he's writing the Persian, it would seem, for a broader, probably less educated audience. And so he's giving them a lot of allegories. But from a literary perspective, there's so much richness in that.
Yes.
To this day, when someone asks me, well, what's a good, I want to read something on Ghazali. I want to learn about Ghazali. I tell them, read The Alchemy of Happiness. Start there. Read the first few chapters on knowing yourself, knowing the afterlife. He sets it up so beautifully. You realize this is a really great teacher, that just like your teacher was, that can bring me to these concepts, to these difficult theological concepts, using something that I'll never forget, that I can relate to the world around me. So whether it's for the simple-minded or not, if it works, it works,
Right.
Yeah.
And that actually brings up an interesting question that I wanted to ask, and you kind of address it in the book, but I'd love to hear you share it here. Is, you're saying storytelling in Islamic philosophy and Sufism.
Yeah.
And those are two different fields, and for some people they may see them as very separate, and even maybe different Sufis and different philosophers would also say that they're separate. But you show that there is actually, especially in virtue theory, there's a big overlap. So maybe you could just kind of introduce why you did that and why that's the case.
Yeah, and you put it very well. So they're different. As you say, they're different sciences, even, we can call them, and were treated as such. It's not to say that there weren't people who crossed over, like the philosopher Sohrawardi that I mentioned. He was clearly a Sufi, and he was clearly a philosopher. And there's some debate as to how he wrote like when he was writing, what was his end? Was he really, writing for some, let's say, super rational realization, or was he really just making modifications to what Avicenna wrote? Anyways, regardless, there were people like him, or Ibn Tufayl, who had, he had Sufi credentials, but he's writing as a philosopher. So there were people who crossed over. But yeah, exactly as you said, what was interesting to me is that when it came to, sort of talking about human completion, the cultivation of virtues, when it came, and it came especially to what comes beyond the cultivation of virtues, that's when you see a lot of crossover between the Sufism and philosophy. So the Sufis are borrowing things from the philosophers, and the philosophers, even those who are seen as not, sometimes described as not really all that interested in Sufism, like Avicenna, they cross over into Sufism. So Avicenna, he writes about nafs al-amara. He writes about, he takes these terms from Sufism and he's using them in his writing. He's interested in them when it comes to him writing about ma'rifah and what's in that which is beyond just the simple cultivation of virtue. So yes, it was there, and I think that's what makes it really interesting. That's where I think if we want to say something like Islamic virtue ethics, right, which is different from the Greek tradition of virtue ethics. I think if we want to say that it exists in some way and it's something that we can study, I think it lies somewhere between these two, or is shared between them and others. I mean, there's so many things I couldn't include, right? There's a whole tradition of wisdom literature that's not necessarily Sufi or philosophical, but it is there. There's fuqaha who are writing about the virtues, that's and sometimes in really interesting ways. They'll take a sort of they'll relate it to Islamic law, or it'll be a separate thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think really, if you step back, that what unites the philosophers and the Sufis is that they both acknowledge and affirm that, to use Plato's allegory, that we're in a cave, but that there is a way out. That this world, as it's experienced by most people, is not the real world. It's not reality. It's a kind of illusory mix of light and dark, of real and unreal. But there is a way to get there, and they differ on how to get there, but they also overlap significantly. And that's really the virtue that this is why, you show like the polished mirror, because our self, our consciousness, our heart, our intellect can be polished, so that we fully reflect these higher qualities, the ultimate reality, the light of truth. And the method to get there, they may differ a little bit, but I think it's actually a little bit, to me, it's quite astonishing how much similarity they have. It's really about acquiring the virtues, removing the ego's illusory kind of desires and pulls which corrode the mirror, block the light, cover the cup, fill the reed flute, whatever analogy we want to use, but are veiling us. This thin veil, even the veil itself, that is an analogy, is an allegory, from seeing things as they truly are. And I wonder if, and the thing is, if you read Ghazali, you read Ibn al-Arabi, you read Maulana Rumi, who, three great Sufi thinkers, they're deeply steeped in philosophy. I mean, I was shocked to the extent, I had studied Ghazali and read him with different Sufi teachers. When I did my master's degree, I wrote on al-Ghazali, and so I read, it wasn't until I really read Ibn Sina and then started reading the Greek philosophical works that I realized how indebted, how much he's taking from Ibn Sina, even though people think, oh, he killed philosophy, but it's like, if you understand how much he took, it would shock most kind of pious traditionalists, right? Like how much he might have took from them. So, but in Ibn Arabi, I wonder if this is a good kind of meeting point for this discussion. He tells that story of when he was a young man and he meets Ibn Rushd.
You're right.
Ibn Rushd being this kind of representative of the later philosophical tradition. Ibn Arabi being Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest Sufi sage. And when they embrace, because Ibn Arabi's father was a friend of Ibn Rushd, so he arranged this meeting. So he comes into, and Ibn Rushd was a famous judge and
Yeah.
philosopher, etc. at the time, Averroes, and they meet, and they have this profound meeting that Ibn Arabi narrates, in which Ibn Rushd says basically why he wanted to meet Ibn Arabi is because he hears that there's this boy that attained the great opening without any work. Essentially,
Right.
it just came to him, and he knew theoretically that was possible, but the philosopher said, no, you have to refine your intellect in these things to attain that.
Yeah.
And so he asked him, when they embraced, he said, what he was, it was like yes or no, right?
Yeah.
And he said, yes, and then he smiled, but then he said no.
Yeah.
Between the yes and no, heads leave their bodies and spirits, heads leave necks and spirits leave bodies. Some like profound kind of allegorical thing, which he said caused Ibn Rushd the blood to rush from his face, and he turned white with kind of. Yeah. So maybe you could.
You remember it so well. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I love that story. No, you're completely right. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me in writing the book is going back to Ghazali. So yeah, Ghazali, is someone who took an interest in philosophy and knows it pretty well. But he sees Sufism as you pointed out, as a kind of way beyond philosophy. Yeah. And because Sufism gives people something very practical where they can perfect themselves in the way that philosophers can. And what makes philosophers wrong is that somehow they assume that merely by using the intellectual process, by reasoning, somehow they can achieve this great end, and they can't. Right now, whether he's right or wrong, it leads to a kind of difference in the way philosophers write and in the way Sufis write when it comes to virtue ethics. The philosophers do, in the end, see this ethics as a kind as a means to allowing allowing the rational soul to do its thing, right, and allowing it to become intellect. That's more or less what they see, and so there's some practical advice there. And I tried to dig through that and show Sohrawardi has more than others. There's some practical advice there, but it's limited. But then when you go to the Sufi side, because the Sufis see the practical part, the training as their main focus and the main part of their science, it's so deep and there's so much there that it really does overshadow philosophy when it comes to what you could call this virtue ethics. And that's why I put it at the latter half of the book. That's why Sufism, it really is almost like the higher education of Islamic virtue ethics, the subtleties of, well, what is an intention? What is it? When you're training the soul, what should you monitor? And then you start with monitoring the senses, but then you also you begin to monitor the heart. What does it mean to monitor the heart? To be careful about what enters even the heart. It becomes so profound that. You can see why someone like Ghazali really took to it. Mm-hmm. It offers something very practical.
And Ghazali has such a profound critique of not only the philosophers but the scholars in general, because he's saying ilm can't get you there. It's ilm and amal. It's not just knowledge, but it's knowledge and works and action and implementation and embodiment. Yeah. And that's really what he says to the Sufis. That's why they are the people of truth, according to Al-Ghazali, because they understand that knowledge is only such that it can be implemented. Mm-hmm. And but that on the other hand, people that only see works without understanding that it's all about the heart. Right. The whole thing is about the heart. It's that hadith nawafil, that the actions are so that you draw near to God until he loves you. And when he loves you, you become the eye with which you see, the ear with which you hear, the hand with which you grasp.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are really amazing. Really amazing. And I love what you said about how I really think this is a profound thing, that these stories, they're not just things we read for edification, but we actually come to live in these mm-hmm. stories. And I think about this a lot as someone who converted to Islam at a young age, because there's something about you come to step into a new universe. Like, I'm the same body, whatever, but I live in a new world and you literally, everything is renamed, which is interesting. You learn a new word for everything.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
everything from the physical universe to, and so I'm really interested in the
Yeah.
ways that these stories that we embody, that we live inside of, color our very experience of reality itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think maybe you've experienced this. I think a lot of us have. Where this case where you hear a story, let's say a hadith, okay, and later someone comes along and it's beautiful and it affects you and it stays with you and you're like, wow, this is so profound, and you bring it up all the time, and then later someone shows you that this hadith, it has no source, or it's not in the books, or whatever, or maybe there was an element in it that was reported to you wrong, but the story stays with you, and it kind of keeps that kind of truth element to it, so you stop caring whether it's narrated or not. Now I know we're treading into dangerous kind of territory, because we're like, well, so it doesn't matter if it's true or not. No, it does matter. But what we're talking about is the fact that stories, yes, these stories about prophets, these stories about great people, on the one hand, they communicate sort of historical facts, but on the other hand, they communicate universal truths. And that's the part that allegory, that people who deal in allegories and the poets are interested in, is the universal truths, And as you say, it makes you, yeah.
And you're getting at this other point that I was thinking about too, is that like, what's, Rumi in particular, but the Sufis more generally, they really emphasize that, for instance, the Quran, everything that's in the scripture is inside of you.
Right.
So they emphasize this relationship to the symbolic, to the human subjectivity, to the archetypal. So, Rumi very explicitly says, when you read about Pharaoh, the point is in the Quran or in the scripture, the point is not to say once upon a time there was a terrible tyrant, but to understand that the terrible tyrant is inside of each one of us.
Right.
And the Moses is too.
Yeah.
So this, you know what I mean? Like, which path are we going to choose? Which, and
he
that's,
can do that. Yeah. He can do that in children's tales too, or what seem to be children's tales, or in, as you said, body kind of raunchy jokes, and he's showing you, in a way, he's showing you a hermeneutical process, which is, here's how you read the universe. This is how it's done. Whether it's a story you hear or something you see, this is how, and he's creating in his audience those kinds of readers, and that's what makes it so powerful.
I love that you say that. That's exactly the perfect way to say it. Here's how you read the universe, and this is what a worldview gives you. And it's interesting because modern secular Western people, we think, oh, we've done away with our myths, right? No, there's a whole inherited worldview. And that's actually one of the great gifts of studying traditional worldviews. I'm sure you can relate to this, is you because we think of, when we look at other people, they didn't necessarily even realize the conditioning of their worldview and how it played on how they saw it, right? We stand outside of history and pure objectivity, but that is obviously false.
Right.
We're also conditioned by our worldview. We have our mythology, we have our meta history, we have our narratives about what's going on, and that colors everything from how we see the world, how we see nature, how we see ourselves, how we experience love, and how we experience everything.
It's absolutely we create. And so what takes the place of the traditional myths are nationalist myths for some, or some scientific, a kind of sort of tech lead to science, and that creates for you, I mean, it's not to say that the science isn't true, it doesn't matter if it is or not, but it gives you some story, something to hang on to, because people are ultimately interested in their origins. And and it's amazing, people don't realize how important it is. So for example, if you grew up in the United States as a person of color, very well how important it is for your ethnicity or religion or whatever it is you identify with, for it to have some meaningful story in the American canvas. And many of them don't, and so it creates all kinds of problems. It's like, who am I if I don't have a good story? You know what I mean? If my people don't have a good story, it's really important. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's deep. Yeah, there's so much we could go into with that. I'm curious if and that actually reminds me, you talk about in the book about the the humors, right?
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
the four humors, because that kind of, you know, colors a lot of this pre-modern worldview and how
Yeah.
people saw the body and even you know, the mind.
Yeah.
And you give the analogy of psychology for modern people,
Right.
because it kind of comes in and filters in, right? Even if you don't have a degree in psychology, just everything how you see the world and how you say, oh, I'm OCD,
Yeah.
or oh, that was my ego, or
Yeah.
oh, that was a Freudian slip,
Right.
or oh, that was the Oedipal complex, and
Yeah.
you know, oh, I'm just working out my process with my issues with my mother and father, right? Just the way that we
Yeah.
see everything
Yeah.
is psychologized, even if we don't necessarily realize it.
Yeah.
So maybe you
Absolutely.
could
No,
speak about
absolutely. You're
that
right.
a little
I
bit.
mean, if you think about how often when someone has some sort of problem, you know, people will even diagnose each other or their friends. They'll say, "Oh, like what happened in your childhood?" You know, and but you're right. And in the case of these writers, that psychology was based on as you said, a humoral model. So you know, they thought about the way the universe was constructed, and the number four is really important. And so you have these four elements, and then within the body, you have the four humors, and they make these four humors. They make you because you're composed in a certain way. You have certain tendencies. You know, you might be the person who's quick to anger, right? Or you might be kind of sluggish and more likely to be depressed. In either case, whichever way the balance in your body um, makes it, um, that is the kind of the first thing you have to deal with. If you're quick to anger, then you have to somehow counterbalance that, right? And try to, you know, slow down, ease up. If you're too easygoing and you're kind of you're leaning toward melancholy, then you have to think about ways to get more active, you know.
Mhm.
But that's just the beginning, of course. Those are just the first stages. But it's so interesting. So, for example, this is something that you know that philosophers wrote quite a bit about when they would write about ethics, this balance of the humors. But then when you get to Rumi, right, by his time, it's so ingrained that I was reading through the Masnavi and I'm like, oh my gosh, he sometimes won't even mention the humors, but the character is like a stereotypical,
Mhm.
you know, whatever you call him, choleric, or he's stereotypical, can be diagnosed with this one problem. And I mentioned one in the book in the chapter 10. But yeah, it was a really important way that they saw the world, that we don't see the world that way anymore, but a lot of the terms have stuck with us. So if you hear someone say, "I'm livid," you know, I think the word is that doesn't livid. I think comes from the word blue or something. Anyways,
Mhm.
these are humoral things. We hear them all the time. You know, don't lose your temper, or
Mhm.
you know, a lot of the words for angry have to do with blood.
Mhm.
You know, so yeah, it's still in our language, but culturally, as you said, we've changed our paradigm, so we don't think like that as much anymore. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And another big kind of change, right? And this is what's interesting about like what it happens in the West in interesting ways, is the whole kind of like Ptolemaic universe, right?
Yeah,
We think, you know, what's the big deal? Some modern people, what's the big deal if the earth is the center, the sun is the center? But no, you have a whole narrative about what's
right.
happening, the seven heavens and the relation of the human being to the heavens and the
Yeah,
earth and all these things. And so if you
yeah,
change the story, like all of it that's tied in and that's assumed and that's ingrained with that, how do you kind of shift
that's
the
right.
story? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a kind of reassessment that has to happen, and then this is what I get into in the conclusion,
Mm.
because in the conclusion of the book, I start to think about, okay, let's talk about relevance. You know, like what's relevant about this anymore, right?
Mhm.
Now, philosophy part, you have to deal with the humors. If you're going to talk about virtue ethics as written by the Brethren, or the Brethren of Purity, or you know, Avicenna, you have to deal with that humoral ethics, which isn't too difficult, because the core of their argument is that human beings are made up from these conflicting desires, and Ghazali actually does a good job of making those desires in a lot of his writings simpler, so that, you know, there's the lustful kind of, there's the consuming desire, and there's the anger desire. And so if you think about it like that, right, then it actually still works. I mean, still most of our problems come down to these things ethically, right? But then when you go to the Sufi side and you think what's relevant about it, you don't have those same problems, because Sufism was dealing more with the language of the heart, the language of intentionality. I'm not saying that they can be abstracted from history, but what I'm saying is they weren't as connected to the science of that time as the philosophical writings were. So it becomes easier to kind of translate that for someone who wants to take those writings and say, make themselves a better person in, you know, in this 21st century of ours, you know?
Yeah, mashallah. I'm interested if is there a specific allegory that is discussed in the book, or a specific story that you might want to share, or that you specifically sticks out to you, or that you took with you from this research that really affected you?
Oh man, so much of it. But I always say nothing really has ever that I've read, that I've read in these kinds of allegories has really affected me ever as much as Ibn Tufayil's Hay ibn Yaqzan. That story is so, I mean, just from a literary perspective, so well told, right? Some have called it the first novel, and I'm not saying it is, but if you read it as that, you see hints of the novel in it, right? Because there's a kind of attention to detail you don't find in the other allegories. You honestly don't even find in Rumi. There's a kind of attention to, so what would it be like to be a child born on an island? You know, the story is that there's this child.
Yeah, will you maybe just give an intro to the story?
Yeah, I'll give a quick synopsis. There's this child. He's there's two accounts of how he's born, because Ibn Tufayl realizes that you know, maybe his first version would be kind of hard to believe. So either he's spontaneously generated on the island. I won't get into how. Or he's like Moses, kind of floats there because something happened to his parents. I won't get into that version either. In either case, he's on an island where there's no other human beings and no major predators, which is like lions and things like that. That's important so that he can survive, right? He's adopted by this deer and raised by her, and he doesn't realize that he's meaningfully different from other animals until he starts to grow up a bit. And when he does, he realizes, for example, that he doesn't have a natural covering for his genitals. He doesn't have natural weapons. And he takes care of these things. But the story really shifts when his mother dies. And he's so distressed and so broken up about
his mother, the deer.
The doe. When she dies, he's so broken up by this that he wants to cure her. So he literally reaches into her body to find out how he can fix her, right? And this is his introduction into the sciences. And this is really going to be his introduction to philosophy. What he starts to do is just using reason and intuition. He makes this discovery about the whole universe just using that island. He's a person without language, and he's a person without any other human beings, but he reaches the pinnacles of philosophical reasoning, and this is the interesting part, Sufi, witnessing of the divine beloved. He gets there. I mean, it takes him, I think, 57 years, but he does. Now, there's this other island close by, and there are two brothers, Salaman and Absal, and you can see he's using these names from the Avicenna tradition. Solomon, Absal. Anyways, Absal decides to leave. He wants to be a hermit too, and he ends up on this island with Hay. They end up together on the same island. And so now Hay comes back with him to civilization, and it doesn't work out. I won't spoil the ending. Someone can read it by their own. But it's beautiful. It's a beautifully told story. And there's so many little details. Like, for example, when they meet, Hay can't recognize Absal because he's never seen another human being, and Absal doesn't want to kind of encroach on. He thinks Hay has come to the island for the same reason as him, to be alone, to be a hermit. So he's like, I won't bother him. And then they meet. It's fascinating. It's told so well, So from a literary perspective, that's the one that sticks out. But from a storytelling allegorical perspective, in terms of richness and complexity, you can't beat Rumi. That whole the entirety of chapter 10. And I don't know, see, I'm still waiting to get someone to really tell me how they did with it. It's a difficult chapter. Why? Because instead of doing what I do in all the other chapters where I pick out things and kind of talk, kind of blend it into my writing, in chapter 10, I want Rumi to speak for himself. So I translate, I follow his logic. And as you know, you're a Rumi reader, you know how it goes to follow Rumi. You're going through all these different, side alleys and, so I'm following him for all of chapter 10. I'm following, I translate long passages, and then I try to react and bring other things from other chapters into it. So it's very different, but it's so rich. You take 10 lines of Rumi, and you realize, man, I have 20 pages to write about here, and there's so many historical references. There's theological references, Quranic, Hadith, all these things going on. He interweaves so much. And at the end, it's so entertaining and gives you so much to work with on a spiritual or ethical or whatever you want to say level that you can't beat that. Yeah.
So what is, in that chapter, is there specific passage?
Yeah. Well, there's one story that holds everything together in chapter 10. But there's many, you know how he works. There's all these mini sort of digression stories there too. So the main story is the judge and the Sufi. It's the story of there's a man who's diagnosed, of course, at home, because doctors did, home visits. He's diagnosed as, the doctor realizes he's going to die, but he doesn't want to tell the man that he's going to die because he wants him to enjoy his last few days. So he says, listen, your cure is just to do whatever you want. Anything you feel, do it, because he wants him to enjoy his life. Wow. He says, okay, in that case, get out. I got to start, I got to start doing this. And so you have really what Rumi has created in the story. I don't know where he's gotten this. It's probably from a joke or something, but you have the person who completely is acting on impulse, right? He's your donkey that you brought up earlier. He's even beyond that. It's complete impulse. So he's walking along the riverbank and he sees this Sufi who's making wudu. And his first impulse is, I want to slap him. So he goes up and the back of the neck here, he slaps him very hard. So Sufi's first impulse is that he wants to punch him, yank out his, mustache hairs and all that. But the Sufi says, he looks at him, he can tell this is a very sick man. If I were to punch him, he might die. And if he dies, I'll be punished. I'll be executed. So I won't do that. Instead, I'll drag him to the judge. So he drags this old man to the judge, and the judge, looks at him and says, listen, the Sufi's demanding to be able to either strike this guy back or to have him be carried around on a donkey in a shame parade in town. This is something that they would do at that time. But the judge doesn't see how that could be done, because he says this man won't live through this. There's just so little left of him. So the judge's verdict is that he says, how much do you have, to the sick man? The sick man says, I have nothing more than, I think it's 6 dirhams. He says, okay, you're going to need something to live on. So you should keep 3 of those dirhams for yourself and then give 3 to him. He says, look, in that case, this is all going through the sick man's mind. He says, look, this is so cheap for me. And he has this urge to hit the judge. So he slaps the judge on the neck. And he says, you keep my 3 and you keep the other 3. Now I'm cured. I'm cured of my disease, So that's the story in a nutshell. But the richness of it goes on in the dialogue. And what happens is there's a very legalistic discussion. It's a fiqhi discussion about retribution and punishment and all of that. But what you realize is that virtue ethics in the story, it rules over the fiqh. It's the way that the judge makes that decision. He looks at the situation that they're all living in, and he has this sense of justice, and he acts on it. Mm-hmm. It's a beautifully told story. And then there's all these little sort of ethical lessons sort of peppered throughout it. But it's really a masterpiece. It's in book 6, Daftar 6 of the.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, mashallah. And I remember from that chapter you talk about, uh, Rumi talks about how taking someone's pulse is a way to understand the health of their heart.
Right.
And what's beautiful is that the heart, it's hidden, it's inward, but it's, the heart obviously symbolically is the spiritual heart too. But yet you take it at the furthest place from the heart, in a sense,
That's
right?
right.
All the way at the
That's true.
wrist.
Yeah.
And so he uses that to launch into this commentary about how the signs of the unseen are in everything, that everything is a pulse. Everything is a pulse of God.
Right.
And then also for the human being, the actions indicate the reality of someone's heart.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just amazing, like reading Rumi is so profound because you kind of get dipped into his universe, and how he sees the world is straight, like pure theophany. That everything is just the pure unfolding of the divine, just God speaking to you at all time, in all moments, in all places, telling you about himself.
Yeah. No, and that's a great example, by the way. I mean, if you think about it from a modern perspective, right? So if you went into, you had a room full of people and you're like, okay, so this chair is real, this table is real. Is humility real? Well, they say, well, it's not real in the same way. Is arrogance real? Well, it's not real in the same way. It's a conception. So what Rumi's saying with that pulse example is that it's real. Why? Because you can tell by looking at a person. When the person walks into the room, everything about their, anatomy is giving you arrogance. And so why isn't that, that's a very real thing, right? That's how things work, right? There's a concept, there's this thing we call humility, but as you say, it becomes manifest in the body and then on the face, and more than the face, but
That's beautiful.
You can see arrogance, you can see humility, you can see these things.
And that's the point of having a spiritual guide, is that just like a doctor, a master physician can look at someone and diagnose them based on various symptoms.
Right.
A spiritual master can see immediately the kind of diseases of the heart that are plaguing an individual, just for sitting with them for a few moments, seeing their arrogance or self-importance, or seeing even their lack of self-esteem, or seeing the way they're kind of veiled by various traits and various qualities. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. You're completely right. That's a very Rumi-esque reading of it too. It's what he was.
Alhamdulillah. Well, I mean, we could go on and on, but you've been very generous with your time.
Wow, thank you for your interest.
It's been great to discuss this, and mashallah, I'm so happy that you wrote this book, and I look forward to kind of continuing on diving into it.
Thank you.
It's one that you can read. And what's cool too is, and I kind of did this, you can jump around. Each chapter is kind of self-contained. They reference each other and it does build, but you could still kind of jump around and take each chapter on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, thank you for reading it, really. Thank you for this conversation. It was really pleasant.
Alhamdulillah. It's my pleasure. And where can people find your work or your writing or this book, or if I don't know if you have online a website or things like that, just let our listeners know so they can follow up.
Well, yeah, the book is it's anywhere books are sold, Amazon, all that, you can find it. But my work in general, I have a pretty decent academia.edu page. You just Google my name, Cyrus Zargar, and academia.edu, and I try to put everything that's not the book, that's not sort of that a publisher wouldn't get on my case about. I try to put everything online, so you can get my articles and things there if you're interested.
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah.
And what are you working on now?
So I'm working on a book on Attar, the Persian poet Attar, and tentatively the title is Religion of Love, and I'm really thinking about those two words, religion and love. And thinking about Attar as almost what you might in contemporary sense call a philosopher of religion. And at the core of his view of what religion is this relationship that we call love. So I'm working through sort of theories of religion about space and ritual and all of that, and applying it to the poetry of Rumi. I mean, Attar.
Mm-hmm.
That's much Rumi.
Attar, who was the biggest influence on Rumi, right?
Right. Yep. Biggest influence on Rumi. He wrote narrative poems, much in the same vein as the Masnavi, that of course influenced Rumi and others.
Right. Mantiqa Tayr, right? The Conference of the Birds was his.
That's right.
What would you recommend as the best kind of translation, or the best? I don't know if there's even a commentary in English, but if someone wanted to read the Conference of the Birds in English.
Well, so I've always used the Peter Avery one. I'm trying to see what there's a new translation out there, and I've seen parts of it, and it was really exciting. Let me see if I can find the name. There's a new translation of the Conference of the Birds.
Because I know a lot of people say that, I've heard people say that are kind of scholars of Persian and scholars of Sufism, that book really gives you everything. That, if you're going to read one book on the kind of Persian Sufi tradition like that, it's just like the sustained allegory of profound depth.
It is, and it gives you everything in a lot of the same way that the Masnavi does. But so I, in the Polished Mirror, I started my work on Attar. So I think it's chapter 9. Chapter 9 is mostly focused with the Conference of the Birds in the Polished Mirror. But you're right. I mean, the Conference of the Birds has so much in terms of, it's I would say the best frame tale to communicate the journey of the soul, right? It's done so well. And then, yes, it has these small sort of vignettes, little stories throughout that tell you, that have these ethical lessons. It's masterfully done. So the translation that I still have only seen parts of, but there's Sholeh Wolpe, last name Wolpe, Wolpe. It's a new translation. I've seen parts of it and it looks great. But I always like first when I would teach and I had students who didn't read Persian, I would always use Peter Avery's translation, and that was a really good one. That's a really good one too. Obviously you're going to disagree, right? Since I translate and he translates, there's parts that I say, okay, I disagree with him here and here. But the big picture, it's pretty easy to understand, has good notes, the Avery version.
Yeah, I don't know. Are any of those like rhyming? Do they keep the rhyme couplet?
No, Avery's doesn't. I mean, it has a kind of poetic sense to it, but
I find it difficult actually. Like, for instance, some people will translate Rumi rhyming couplets, and I get the point of it is to kind of simulate that, but it tends to feel forced to me. It's kind of, I find it very difficult to read translations that also rhyme.
I see that too, and so when I teach Rumi, I do Alan Williams' translation of the first. He just did the first one, the first volume. He has because what he does is, Alan Williams, when he translates the Masnavi, he does it. He kind of does blank verse, so it doesn't rhyme, but it kind of has a meter. But if he needs to, he abandons that. So if it's like if the sense dictates it, he just like, okay, it's fine. I'll just do my best, So it makes it very kind of have a poetic feel to it, but as you say, without the rhymes. So, yeah.
MashaAllah. Hey, well, thank you for your time, and
thanks for having me.
We're honored to speak with you about this.
Well, the honor was mine as well. Thank you. It's great to be here.